So the last book of the wisdom literature is the book of Sirach, one of the deuterocanonical books only found in a Catholic Bible. It's known by other names, so it can get very confusing. It's also known as Ecclesiasticus from the Latin, okay? And this can be easily confused with Ecclesiastes, which we did a couple weeks ago. So Ecclesiastes is a preacher, if you remember, Koheleth in Hebrew. Well, Ecclesiasticus is the church's book, okay? Ecclesiastes is somebody who addresses an assembly. Ecclesiasticus is an assembly, okay? It's just a different form of the same basic root word as Ecclesiastes. And Ecclesiasticus is literally the church's book, because the church is derived from the same root word in Greek, anyway, ekklesia. Kalein in Greek means to call. Easy to remember, because to call, kalein. And that little prepositional prefix e or x means out of. So the ones who are called out of the world, we can supply the world to that, but we're the ones who've been called out. And this is the ones who've been called out's book. And it has other additional titles derived from Hebrew and Greek. Sometimes it's called just wisdom, or the wisdom of Jesus, the son of Sirach, or the book of wisdom. That's really confusing it with the book of wisdom, okay? And or the wisdom of Sirach, or the proverbs of Jesus of Sirach, and so on. In modern times, we simplified it and we call it commonly Sirach. So that's the only way I've ever known to call it. The Jews rejected it from their canon, but evidence in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are many copies of it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, points to the belief among earlier Jews that it was inspired. So evidence exists that it was originally written in Hebrew, and it's one of those books that this is pretty rare, I guess. As we go through the Old Testament, there's so much disputed dating, speculations about when something is dated, when it was written. This is not the case with this book. We know who wrote it. We know when they wrote it. Why? Because they tell us in specific detail. We have no reason to doubt this. So it's really not disputed too much that it was written around 180 BC, and then it was translated eventually into Greek in around 132 BC. So what we're reading in our Bibles, at least in my Bible, is the Greek, the English translation of the Greek, and so that includes a prologue by the grandson of the author, is translating it in 132, and translating it and referring to the work and his grandfather, and says, look, it's tough. It was originally expressed in Hebrew, and it does not have exactly the same sense when translated into another language. So Hebrew's a very poor language in the sense that there'll be like one or two words for something. Greek, there might be 7 or 8. It's a very rich language in terms of you can use Greek to be very precise and nuanced. Hebrew is kind of open-ended. Man, they're big, elastic terms that have a broad application. You have to tease out of the context or whatever. So it's good for poetry and so on. And Greek is good for philosophy, for descriptions of the physical universe or whatever. But anyway, yeah, they don't they're very different languages, and it doesn't translate into Greek very well. I mean, you're taking something that can be translated, a word in Hebrew that can be translated 7 or 8 different ways into Greek. And you have to choose between 7 or 8 different words sometimes, and so then you're like, man, it could go in so many different directions. So the translator here is admitting that the grandson of Jesus ben Sirach, ben meaning son, Jesus ben Sirach. So let's see. It's modeled on the book of Proverbs, so it's very similarly written to the book of Proverbs. It's very different from the book of Wisdom, which we just read, which has a lot more Greek influence, and I talked about that last time. Sirach is more traditional Jewish wisdom, so it's kind of reverting back to that style of writing, very similar to Proverbs, using the traditional Jewish bicolae. Remember, not a bicola, not the Coke commercial, but the two things that say the same thing or say the opposite thing or whatever, just this kind of parallelisms and repetition. It's kind of, massaging something by saying it twice in different ways. You get deeper into it, penetrating, pressing into something, and it's just a beautiful, poetic device, literary technique the Jews use. And so it's very similar to the book of Proverbs, with this difference, though, that it's much more expansive. This is 51 chapters. Proverbs is 31 chapters. And there's greater thematic unity. Proverbs is a little more random and jumps around a lot more, whereas this author organized his material topically. So he'll just, put together a whole string of these different sayings about speech. And then he'll shift to wealth and riches or something like that. He just jumps around topically. There's a structure to it, but we'll get to that. But he also is different in Sirach, the author of Sirach. Unlike Proverbs, he refers explicitly to the law of Moses and the covenant. And so he's making references to the history of Israel more than you don't find that in the book of Proverbs. So explicit references to the covenant with Moses, the worship of the temple, and so on. And of course, at the end, from chapter 44 to the end, is one big, long, eulogy of all these great characters of salvation history. So it's very different from Proverbs in that sense. You don't really find references to salvation history or the law of Moses very much, or the worship of the temple in any of the other wisdom literature either. I mean, you don't find in Ecclesiastes or the book of Wisdom too much either, or the Song of Songs. But in Sirach, it's very prevalent throughout the thing. You'll see different places where it's made reference to. Now, the praise of God is beautifully described in this book of Sirach, and the cultivation of the life of prayer in Sirach. So it's kind of liturgical and spiritual in that sense, where it's giving instruction and underscoring the value and importance of prayer and worship and the praise of God, which is, we're going to read some of those in the second part of this thing. You don't find that in Proverbs really either. Used extensively for catechesis in the early church. They loved this book in the early church. Many commentaries were written on the book of Sirach, and it was a big favorite in the early church because it's so applicable to daily life, as we're going to see. It's wonderful. It's used extensively. So, not directly quoted in the New Testament, but man, there are so many instances where, didn't our Lord say that? Didn't St. Paul say that? Didn't James, the apostle, say that? I mean, it's like, whoa. Maybe it isn't a direct quotation, but it's at least an allusion. I mean, it's a dang near close, almost verbatim repetition of what's said in the New Testament. So Paul had to have been reading Sirach, James, and so on. I mean, this was something that people had to have been exposed to at the time the New Testament was being written. So it's a 51 chapter massive summation of the Israelite wisdom tradition. And Hebrew, Chokmah, just good to hear that term. The word Chokmah, Hokmah, is the Hebrew word for wisdom. It's kind of a nice sounding word, Chokmah. which for the Jews is more of a practical wisdom, ordering our lives to what's truly good and fulfilling for us, to the ways of God, the commands of God, and not so much speculative reasoning. So righteous living, knowledge about righteous living. What does it mean to be righteous and just in the eyes of God, which is equivalent to being happy for the Jews. So it's more practical wisdom. This is incredibly practical, the book of Sirach, about our interactions with one another. Wow, insight galore into human psychology and sociology and everything else, familial relationships and everything. I'm going to give you a sampling in the second half, but the structure has basically 3 groupings of instruction. It's nice. The first part is kind of geared towards the young man or young people, 1 through 23. Then you have these beautiful creation hymns or poems or whatever that kind of divide these different segments. There's 3 segments. The first, the young man. The second is the older man, an older man. By and large, you could say that that's what those sections are ordered to. And then the final section I already told you was this great long eulogy, chapter 44 to 51. So 1 to 23, the young man. 24 to 43 is the old man. And 44 to the end of 51 is in praise of famous men. Sorry, ladies, you got left out. I didn't see any women in there, I don't think. All right, so in the section on the guidance for young men, you'll hear things about speech and friendship, dealing with persons from all walks of life, how to conduct oneself as a young man, graciously and respectfully in all kinds of social situations. It's really interesting. Refraining from sin, self-control, control of your speech, and really fidelity to your vows and oaths. The second section, geared towards older men, guidance for the older man, is more about relating to others, coping with the troubles of life and anxieties and struggle of life. Kind of reminds me of the famous 4 paintings. Aren't there 4 paintings? Yeah. You see at the Smithsonian of the 4 stages of a man's life. And I love that. The idyllic nature of the young man and his blissful ignorance about the harsh realities of life. Sailing down this river with this pastoral scene. Everything's like perfect bliss. Me playing wiffle ball in the backyard. And then you go on to the next one. And you see this young man all full of piss and vinegar, man. He's like 10 feet tall and bulletproof, standing in the prow of the ship, like ready to take on the world. And he's like looking off like this, but you can look downstream past him and see there's just the beginnings of a little bit of rapids. And then the next one, he's like hanging on for dear life in the middle of these like rapids, and he's growing a beard, and he's like, and then at the end, he's like dead dog tired, like just sitting there hanging, and he's being spewed out into this like peaceful, serene harbor, and you see these angels coming out of the clouds to take him up into heaven. It's really cool. So I had that in my mind as I was reading the book of Sirach. But now women are mentioned in this thing, but I would maintain that they're, even though at times it sounds like it's kind of harsh on women, there's some verses that are a little harsh sounding at first reading, but just read them very carefully and look at the context, because I'm telling you, pay close attention to the context. At times it sounds like the woman's sin is worse than the man's or whatever. And I think the way to understand and interpret all those types of things where it talks about women and their faults and failings and sins, because the book of Sirach is extremely respectful and sings the praises of women. I really think women are the, they are, what's the word? the high point of creation. Is that the right word? High point. And God's, the crowning jewel of creation was the woman. And so the corruption of the best is the worst. I think if you have that in mind as you're reading those and see that he is respectful towards women. But those few problematic passages, some people grab them out of context, and it's not really fair to the book. Corruptio optimi pessima. The corruption of the best is the worst. Just look at the Jesuits. Oh, snap. No, I love the Jesuits. I wish I was a Jesuit. I have a Jesuitical heart. Oh, is that a good thing? All right, so, if you, the corruption of the best is the worst. Look at the devil, Lucifer, the angel of light, God's most powerful creature, and he's very bad. Just leave it there. Fear of the Lord is a great way to summarize the whole book of Sirach. For him, this is the key. This is the root of wisdom, the fear of the Lord. Reverential love and eagerness to please God. So it's not a servile fear of punishment. It's a fear that's derived from love. The eyes of the Lord are on those who love him, Sirach says. He really wants us to love him. And when we love him and live from that relationship of love, we don't want to do anything to disrupt it. And we're just so careful not to do anything to damage that relationship because we love God. Reverential love and eagerness to please God. That is a definition, a working definition of the fear of the Lord. So he's going to talk a lot about the fear of the Lord, and we're going to hear a whole bunch of those in a little bit. Charity to the poor is emphasized. Doctrine of free will. Yeah, we can talk about that. 14 to 17. This is just interesting. The doctrine of free will comes up in here, and something the Catechism actually draws upon. The power of choice lies in our hands. Do not say because of the Lord I left the right way. God tempts no man, and doesn't cause us to sin. For God will not do what he hates. This is chapter 15, verse 11 and following. Do not say it was he who led me astray, for he has no need of a sinful man. The Lord hates all abominations, and they are not loved by those who fear him. It was he who created man in the beginning, and he left him in the power of his own inclination. If you will, you can keep the commandments. And to act faithfully is a matter of your own choice. He has placed before you fire and water. Stretch out your hand for whichever you wish. Before a man are life and death, and whichever he chooses will be given to him. He has not commanded anyone to be ungodly, and he has not given anyone permission to sin. God has never tempted anyone that there isn't a way out. Now, there's a catechism quote on this, 1730. 1730 says, it quotes Sirach here. God created man a rational being, conferring on him the dignity of a person who can initiate and control his own actions. God willed that man should be left in the hand of his own counsel, free will, so that he might of his own accord seek his Creator and freely attain his full and blessed perfection by cleaving to him. Man is rational and therefore like God. He is created with free will and is master over his acts. All right, so creation and the law is very interesting. It reminds me of Psalm 19, one of the wisdom psalms, where it begins with this beautiful depiction singing the praises of creation and them singing the praises of God. And then it suddenly just abruptly shifts to this meditation on the law of God. So in a certain sense, the law of God is corresponds to the natural law, you know? I mean, it's part of nature in a certain sense. It's built into the fabric of creation. So you're talking about creation, and it's a natural segue to just start talking about the law governing our actions. Pretty cool to connect those two things. And you see that in the book of Sirach, because you have all these wonderful poems interspersed about creation, and it's really beautiful. And keep Psalm 19. Go back and read Psalm 19 if you want, as you read before you start reading the book of Sirach. This book of Sirach is generously employed in the lectionary of the church. We use it quite a bit throughout the year, so it's kind of neat. So it's a very rich book. It's the book of the church. And sorry for busting out the Jesuits. They're always the butt of every joke, though, so they've got to be used to it by now. Let's take a little break. And after we're done the break, I'm going to rip through and give you a whole sampling of a whole bunch of these different topics. We're going to have some fun. So come back after the break.